There was a time when Jesus made a promise as well. Just before he left this earth, before he went to heaven, he made a promise. And we have to ask ourselves, are the promises of Jesus worth believing? If he says something, is it likely to come true? Listen to what he says in John chapter 14. He says, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also." Big promise there from Jesus. Three things he says. He says, one day I'm going to go. I promise that I go and prepare a place for you in heaven. The second part of the promise is, I'm going to come back to this earth again sometime in the future. And the third part of this promise is, I'm going to gather up all those who belong to Jesus and take them to be with him forever. We talk a lot about Jesus, don't we? We talk a lot about sin and salvation. But something we sometimes forget is the fact that one day he's coming back to this earth to collect us all. Now, because it's a long time ago, there are some people in the New Testament who started to wonder if maybe Jesus had forgotten his promise. Maybe they thought to themselves, well, perhaps he's just not able to come back again. They were thinking, if this has gone on a long time, surely he's forgotten. And other people were thinking, maybe he's already come back and gathered all the people he wanted to gather, and now we're all left behind. Well, that's not true. Jesus says it still hasn't happened yet, and we still have to look ahead. Well, I want to tell us a story this morning which will help us to understand about promises. And there's a man who made a promise a long, long time ago, about 100 years ago, and I want to tell you his story this morning. Okay, what do you think that's a picture of? The sea. I'm glad you recognised it, the sea. Okay, now this was a man called Ernest Shackleton. Anybody heard of Ernest Shackleton? Okay, about 100 years ago he decided to go off to explore a very cold part of the world. Right at the bottom of the world, there's a continent called, anyone know the name of it? Antarctica, yeah. Right at the bottom, you see it on the maps, it's nearly always coloured white. The reason it's coloured white is because it's covered in snow and ice. So he gathered together a big crew, he got to himself a ship, and he got 28 men in his ship. And the idea was that he would sail down to the edge of Antarctica, he would leave one ship there, and then he would take some of his crew, and they would walk to the South Pole, that's right at the bottom, and then from the South Pole they'd walk to the other side of the continent, where there would be another ship waiting to rescue them and to take them back to where they came from. Okay, so first of all then, we need to see the ship that he had. So let's look at this ship. Here's his ship. Anybody know the name of his ship? His ship was called, I hear someone saying it over there, the ship was called the Endurance because it was going to have to endure a lot of hard things. It was going to have to go to a place where ships very rarely go, right to the very, very cold part of the Antarctic. And as he started taking this journey, and as he got closer and closer to the South Pole, what do you think maybe started to appear in the sea? What do you think? It got colder, yeah. What do you think he might have started to see? Look, what do you think? Ice, yes, that's right. He started to see icebergs floating around in the water. Okay. Looks cold already, doesn't it? Can you imagine being on that ship, sailing along and seeing all this ice everywhere around? But it wasn't just a few icebergs. The closer they got to the south, there was more and more ice. Until suddenly, it wasn't just a little bit of ice floating about, suddenly they had a big problem, because the problem was that there was too much ice. It's completely covered with ice, so much so that the ship was not able to move. Can you imagine that, being in a ship where there's so much ice that it's completely frozen over, and so the ship got stuck? And they had to wait there until the ice thawed out. Well, now in the Antarctic, it's not like being here where perhaps it snows one day or it's a bit icy in the morning and then by the afternoon the ice is gone. They had to wait 8 months until the ice thawed out. But meanwhile, the ice kept growing and the ice kept pushing in on the ship, until eventually the ship started to break up. And as the ship started to break up, so it started to fall to one side. The men realised that the ship was no longer going to carry them to where they wanted to go, so the ship just became a place where they had to live. And so they kind of made their camp, or they made their home inside the ship. Well, eventually the ship broke up completely and they had to get off the ship because there was a danger that the ship was going to sink. In fact, later on the ship did sink. And so what they had to do, they had to make their camp on the ice. So they came off the ship and instead they made their camp there on the ice. It was probably bigger than just 2 tents because there were 28 men. So there they were, having to just make sure that they weren't on the ship just in case the ship went down. And as the ice started to break up, eventually they realised, well, they couldn't use their ship anymore. So what they did, they took the lifeboats off the ship, they made sure they rescued those before the ship went down, and then some of them started to get ill. It was a very cold and harsh place to be. Can you imagine living for months and months and months in this terribly cold and inhospitable place? And finally, Mr. Shackleton, Ernest Shackleton, he said to himself, you know what, I'm not ill yet, I'm still quite fit. I'm going to go and see if I can get us all rescued. So, with one of the lifeboats that was left, they managed to put a lot of good stuff in it. They kitted it out with supplies. They made sure it was strong and seaworthy. And he took 5 of the men, and they got into this lifeboat when the ice broke up a little bit because they couldn't use this ship anymore. And he said to the men, wait here, I will come back. And I make a promise to you, not one of you will be lost. So he got into his ship and he sailed away in his little lifeboat, tiny little lifeboat. And remember, this is a very, very harsh place to live. And so the men that were left, they waited there and they just stood and they watched and they waited for Shackleton to come back. And time went by and the months went by and their beards started to grow and they got all frosty on the tops of their heads. Do you think there was any company there? Do you think there was much that they could do? There wasn't much company. It's a shame Travis isn't here today, so I know he likes these things. All they had for company was a few penguins. And they just had to wait. Now, they didn't know what had happened to Ernest Shackleton. He'd gone off, and the seas were very choppy, and the temperature was very cold, and it was one of the most dangerous places to take a lifeboat anywhere in the world. And they had no idea of what had happened to him. And they knew that if that lifeboat capsized, that if Shackleton and those 5 men had gone down with the ship, then nobody would ever know they were there and they would never be rescued. So they waited, and they waited for Shackleton for 4.5 months. And then one day, finally, they saw a ship coming. They had been rescued because Shackleton had gone off, he had found help, and the ship came to pick them up. They'd waited all together, they'd been stuck there for 1.5 years waiting to be rescued. It reminds me of this, that if Shackleton, a normal man like anybody else, if he could make a promise to say, not one of you will be lost, and he was true, he was right, not one man was lost. Every single one was picked up and rescued and taken back to safety. If a man like that could say to his men, don't worry, I've made a promise, not one of you will be lost, how much more should we believe Jesus when he says that not one of us will be lost? That he will come back and he will gather all of those who have believed in him. He will gather them to be with him. He will come back for us and he will make sure that we live with him forever in heaven. Listen to what the New Testament says. And I'm reading this from the ERV to make it easier to understand. But don't forget this one thing, dear friends. To the Lord a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. The Lord is not being slow in doing what he promised, the way some people understand slowness. But God is being patient with you. He doesn't want anyone to be lost. He wants everyone to change their ways and to stop sinning. God keeps his promises. He will not forget his promises. If he has promised to come back to collect us, he will do it. Even though it seems as if we're waiting a very, very long time. Even though it seems the world is waiting for a long time for Jesus to come back. He says he will come back. And because we know he's coming back, the Bible encourages us to make sure we live our lives in such a way that when Jesus does come back, we'll be ready to meet him. Shall Should we pray this morning?